soul, the idea of the soul, this kind of undefinable presence, indwelling nature that humans seem to possess, is sort of the magnetic north that depth psychology is kind of oriented towards. It's like the heart of the labyrinth. I think we're living in a world and a culture and a time that denies and exiles, destroys the soul, whether if it is through planetary destruction, the soul of the world, the unprecedented epidemic levels of what is called the mental health crisis. We could say that, we're living in a time or a society or a culture that has lost its soul.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. Of course, I think taking the soul seriously is a must. Of course, I also would like to attach a lot of nuance and clarification to what that means. But it does really beg the question, how does one even begin to do that in a remotely responsible way that is felt and nutritious, that isn't just completely untethered, just dipped in a sauce of spiritual bypassing, of pandering, ego stroking woo? One of the ways that has certainly captivated me is the tradition of depth psychology, the path that largely grew out of the philosophy and method of the mythopoetic genius and psychiatrist Carl Jung. His thought is really a mainstay of the channel, as many of you probably know, and I suppose this segues right into our guest in this mind meld, Simon Yugler, because he is a therapist in that tradition, but he's also a growing voice in this community of psychedelically informed depth psychology practitioners that work in, I'll just call it, some incredibly deep archetypal waters. He really guides people on some of the most profound soul-finding work one can do. And on that note, he's got a really good book coming out, Psychedelics and the Soul, a mythic guide to psychedelic healing, depth psychology, and cultural repair. All those links that you will need for Simon and his new book are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. And on that note, this is where I ask you to tickle the algorithm with a like, a sub, a comment, a share. All of it is truly appreciated, truly helpful. And if you're digging these transmissions, we've got hundreds more, but many of them are audio only. So do subscribe to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to pods. Drop us a review there. All algorithms must be tickled, unfortunately. And if you want to initiate yourself deeper, join in the conversation with me and hundreds of other like-minded wonder dippers. Head over to patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. You can get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. We have a patron-only Discord server. We do a book club. We do monthly Wonder Gym hangs on Zoom where you can talk about whatever you want. Of course, I would love nothing more than to riff with you there, but for now, let's meld minds with Simon Yugler. So there's always this trouble of how much exposition to do with these things, like these conversations. And I do generally think that listeners are pretty familiar with Jung, depth psychology, what it is. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of people watching who are sort of, they're vaguely familiar, like, oh yeah, psychology, therapy. But as you and I both know, psychology is nothing approaching a monolith. There's completely different emphasis, completely different theories, completely different sorts of, I would even argue, goals behind a lot of different approaches to psychology. So you're particularly in this depth psychology tradition, disposition. So I'd love to hear you riff on why depth psychology, what sets it apart, and what really drew you to it.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I feel like Carl Jung and, technically Freud was also a depth psychologist. Depth psychology really just means any form of inner work that takes the unconscious as a fact and perhaps sort of foundational motivating factor of our behavior and identity and who we are. I feel like the discovery of depth psychology, I have this sense that it Jung and Freud and kind of these early founders of the movement didn't so much create it. And I think, if I could be so bold as to say, I think Jung would would agree that he discovered it. He sort of excavated it out of the earth.
Right.
And I like to think of depth psychology specifically for the Western tradition, for the European mind to be this sort of artifact that was sort of excavated out of the ground, of European culture, you know, um, and Freud and Jung, in the early 20th century, found these sort of pot shards and these things sticking out of the ground, metaphorically speaking, and kind of excavated them. And Freud sort of picked up his little pot shard and was like, well, this is what it is, and sort of came to a lot of sort of conclusions and dogmatic theories about what the thing was. And I think Jung just sort of kept digging
Yeah.
carefully and actually exposed more of the thing, more of the buried ruin, so to speak. And the way I like to look at it is that, you know, Jung was able to excavate deep enough to see the complete picture, or at least, when you look at like a ancient skeleton of like a, you know, ancient human or
Yeah.
dinosaur or something,
Do it all
there's
the
like
time.
a lot of missing parts, and the scientists can fill in what
Hmm.
they believe would be missing and complete the picture. I think that was the case for Jung, and what he sort of articulated, over the course of his life and his work was this thing that I think the West lost, millennia ago. And that thing used to be sort of almost like a cultural, psycho-spiritual vessel that we could call, a complete human culture.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, well said. And I agree. There is this perennial wisdom that is sort of slumbering beneath the surface at all times, that is within all of these traditions, all of this historical stuff that Jung unearthed and then brought into the fold of the modern discourse again through a psychological prism. And what's interesting about it is you see how that thing takes different shape at different times in history. If we were talking about, huge surprise to all the listeners, we were talking about Platonism a little bit before we started recording, and it's like you see that wisdom taking a specific shape at that specific time. And in many ways, Plato and Jung, I think, are, it's funny because there's a little bit apparently of dissonance between, at least from Jung's perspective. I don't think Plato had any thoughts on Jung that I'm aware of. um, uh, but I really think that they were doing the same thing in their own time. And what I mean is that they're taking whatever that transcendent truth is, and they're putting it in the most sophisticated, most nutritious language possible that they could have been at that time. And they did such a good job of it that it almost feels like these men are bordering on something more than human, or something more than just, two guys sitting around talking. And I think the reason that is because they were the ones that truly did this miraculous, I don't know, they pulled this philosophical rabbit out of a hat. And what I mean by that is they were able to take that true thing and really wrap it in something that people could interface with, understand, but also realize that they needed to do themselves. That's another huge commonality of, like, you see what Socrates is doing in all the Platonic dialogues, and you see what Jung is doing with his method. These people are like midwives for people to do the work
Mm,
themselves,
mhm,
to realize deeper truths themselves. And you see this happening, you know, like I was saying before, throughout the ages in different ways. Like, eventually, all of this Platonic stuff metamorphosizes into the Hermetic vein, and then
mhm.
that becomes alchemy. And oh look, it's suddenly wrapped in metallurgy and doing proto-chemical work. And then, as Jung later comes along and says, no, it's really more about inner work and all of that stuff, but that's also looking at it through a completely psychological modern prism and not the whole story. But anyway, it's amazing how these truths come to the surface again, time and time again. And then we're able to absorb a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more with each iteration. And I sort of see how that's happening in our time. But at the same time, I'm also like, I don't even know if we're ready to do it again yet. I don't even know
Hmm.
if we're able to go to a level where by the end of our lifetimes there is going to be some new emerged philosopher's stone or something. But maybe this would be a fun sidebar or avenue to go down is what is that thing, the new version of that thing being born, do you think? And do you
Yeah.
think it's like really amorphous and undefined right now, or do you think it's starting to solidify into something you can recognize?
It's a really interesting question, Michael. I mean, what as you were speaking of like, are we ready for this work again in a new way, right? Part of me, was thinking like, we're already living in a time and a context where all of this kind of inner conflict and darkness or shadow and madness is actually being expressed in the world all around us.
Yeah.
And I think it's, yeah, we're living in some extraordinary times. And I think from a depth psychological perspective, we're living in a time of what I think Mary Louise von Franz and Jung and others would call the return of the repressed.
Hmm. Hmm.
We're witnessing, at least here in the US, on a sort of national scale, and in so many other countries, kind of the return of a lot of repressed energies and angers and wounds that are kind of being, you know, traumatically reenacted, on the collective, on a planetary level. We're kind of sitting with the bill of our
Yeah.
civilization's behavior, you know, through centuries of colonial extraction, right? We're like witnessing the culmination of a lot of behavior, um, and so it's almost kind of like we don't have to really look very far. We don't really even have to. It doesn't really even have to be this like new form of kind of rediscovering or remaking all of these ancient esoteric practices and tools and traditions, because it's like all unfolding in the world around us. So all
Yeah.
we have to do is like pay attention to the kind of terrifying reality that we're all sort of sitting with and navigating. So I think it's kind of all there, and I think thinking about Jung's life and work, so much of his life was kind of um, defined by World War One and World War Two.
Yeah.
Specifically, I would say more so World War Two, but like these two horrific wars, that really played pivotal roles in his thinking. Watching kind of the tide of fascism sweep over Europe, and really being really close to that, and seeing this sort of what he called, I think, like Odin
Yeah.
energy sweep over the German people, and um, so yeah, I think we're sort of living in similar times, um,
Yeah.
and I also think it's why uh, people are needing, I would say, more and more drastic means of help.
Yes.
More let's say heavier tools to help them move through the suffering that is all around us.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's that overly used but true phrase that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And maybe a more mythopoetic way to say that is, to introduce that different kind of time, that kairos that is talked about all the time among mythopoetically, um, I don't know, informed or the mythopoetically curious folk who sense that there seems to be these motifs, these archetypes that just replay over and over again, and then they manifest in history or the zeitgeist that we're living in today. And these things can even constellate in certain figures. Like one person can be a sort of either possessed or like a by that archetypal energy, or become like a distillation or constellation of that energy. But maybe before we go there, you served me up a nice opportunity there by starting to talk about heavier tools
Mm.
to deal with these things. And it's funny because I think we all, whatever side of the like political conversation or whatever your interpretation of modern events is, it seems like one thing that unifies people is they feel like, oh my god, like that we're really in some kind of, I don't know, like birth pains, or like the last straw, or that we can fit on the camel's back is like about to be introduced or something. And yeah, it just seems like everybody has these really extreme interpretations of where we're at right now, and that is scary. However, it's funny how it seems like just the medicine we need, or the ingredients for the medicine we need, are right there too. And returning to the first question about, what is depth psychology, what does it offer that other kinds of psychology don't? That is absolutely, I think, one of the possible tools. And I'm sure you agree. So I'd love to hear you riff on why you think so.
Why depth psychology is one of the tools that we
Yeah.
may need during this
Yes,
period
exactly.
of time. Yeah. I think, look, at least the depth tradition that I am most close to, which is kind of the mythopoetic tradition and the Jungian tradition, which aren't separate. Soul, the idea of the soul, this kind of undefinable presence, indwelling nature that humans seem to possess, is sort of the the magnetic north that depth psychology is kind of oriented towards. It's like the heart of the labyrinth. And I think we're living in a world and a culture and a time that denies and exiles and destroys the soul. Whether if it is through um, planetary destruction, the soul of the world, whether it is through the kind of unprecedented epidemic levels of what is called, mental health, the mental health crisis, this
Hmm.
crisis of depression and anxiety and loneliness and hopelessness and all of these sort of expressions, that we can call a crisis of mental health, to me is a crisis of the soul, or whether it's through the sort of increasingly untenable demands of living in a capitalist society and economy, right? And which seeks to extract the soul from everything it touches. You know, I think that's the timeline we're in,
Yeah.
so to speak. And depth psychology to me is so meaningful and useful because it is a approach of inner work and understanding that is based all around the soul and preserving a kind of dignity of the soul
Hmm.
and acknowledging that the soul uh, exists, which kind of automatically terrifies the ego to acknowledge the soul, and Uh, I think a lot of the, let's call it like collective maladies or issues or crises that we're experiencing, we could say that, we're living in a time or a society or a culture that has lost its soul. And, James Hillman, who we're both
Yeah.
into, talked about the desouling of the world, which started centuries and centuries ago, at the start of this thing that is ironically called the European Enlightenment,
Right.
you know, where any sort of subjective intelligence or presence that people used to sort of um, ascribe to plants, animals, places, you name it, was kind of pushed into the realm of heresy and witchcraft.
Yeah.
And so,
Or just
starting around
nonsense, right?
or
Yeah.
just nonsense,
Yeah.
right? And so once that kind of became the way it is, at least in the European world, that kind of spelled the end of a soulful way of living on this planet. And I think we're kind of sitting with the bill of that situation now.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. And at the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge that it never really went away. You have that great like Goethe quote, for instance. He's somebody who was this whole line of romantics that
Hmm.
comes in the wake of the scientific enlightenment. They are there,
Yeah.
but at the same time, we don't really understand. At least, I don't. I didn't going to like public school in America. I didn't understand why they were important. I didn't understand why the American romantic poets were important. I just learned that Ralph Waldo Emerson was a Neoplatonist and was I forget that there was a guy that he was connected with, um and somebody was just telling me about, it was Gregory Shaw. I was telling you before. Professor Gregory Shaw was telling me about how he was purposely like really reintroducing a lot of Neoplatonist ideas into his poetry and just like shifting the language slightly. But anyway, um, but we don't learn that stuff. We don't learn that there is this lineage of sacred ideas and that it's more sophisticated than you either are part of a mainstream religion and go to church on Sunday or you don't and you're an atheist. That's really the way that I kind of grew up, is that either you're smart enough to realize that these religious institutions are manipulating people or you're not. And, oh, so you just believe it, this straw man type of God. And you get that like young person, I'm smart kind of hubris. So I don't believe in these fairy tales. And then as long as you stay curious and open minded, you start getting introduced to these other thinkers and you start hearing about, people like these, like the romantics, like the Jungs, like the, people that were part of the earlier wave of psychedelic counterculture, or even honestly, just Descartes. I mean, there's so much straight up spiritual language in Descartes. This idea that there there is a substance of mind, for instance. That's a central part of his like mind body dualistic um sort of philosophy. But anyway,
Do you have to
yeah.
do you have to get there? Do you have to drink a bunch of tar to have the revelation of that? Was didn't Descartes
Oh,
drink tar?
I don't know. I actually
Yeah,
don't
I
know. I
think he
don't remember
drank
that.
tar
Sure.
to sort of, trip out his body and see if he could see the separation
Is there some kind of
there.
psychoactive component to tar?
No, no, it's just bizarre, like crazy
It's just like an
person
intrusive thought.
behavior.
Like,
Yeah.
I'm going to drink this
I'm gonna drink
tar.
tar and see if my mind is still my mind,
Whoa. Yeah,
even
no,
if I
I didn't.
fuck up my body.
I didn't
Yeah.
remember that part. I didn't remember that part.
I might be
Um,
wrong. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure he
he did
drank
do. I
tar.
know he did do a lot of weird things, like because one of the things, obviously that comes along with this idea, right, is that nature's just basically this machine. I think like he was Christian, so he believed that humans had a soul, but I don't like. I'm pretty sure he did not believe animals had souls,
No,
and he
he
did
did a
some
bunch of horrible
horrific,
shit
yeah,
to
yeah,
animals. Yeah.
horrific
Yeah.
experiments on animals, and yeah. So, but anyway, that yeah. Regardless, there are I'm not even going to finish that whole diatribe that I was going on, but there are massive costs, and I talked about this with Rick Tarnas, is like the massive costs of really being ensconced in this way of thinking where there is no soul, there is no sacred, there is no purpose or teleology to being a human being. You're just adrift basically in this mechanistic worldview that doesn't care about you. You're living in this like cold infinity. You're lucky to be alive. You're shivering on a little rock in the middle of, you know, an endless abyss. And that's it. That's kind of it. Like, have fun with that. Have fun making sense of that. And not only is it that, but when you're brought up that way, if you start to become more spiritually curious, you have almost zero ability, you have zero literacy, mythopoetically speaking, and you're completely out of context. So you're just searching. And I think that
Yeah.
the very first stop there is the lazy kind of new age conflated nonsense spirituality that's just
Right.
a connection of buzzwords, like, I'm sure you and I could rattle off the 10 words that basically comprise social media spirituality in a lot of cases,
Yeah. And I think
Uh,
it's why people
yeah.
kind of fall for it,
Yes.
because there is no kind of deeper cultural context or mythopoetic container for
Hmm.
their experiences. So they get duped, by charlatans, basically.
Right. Yeah. And so to bring this back to the initial thread of how depth psychology can actually lead us into a felt sense of the sacred and build that context. So you talked about this idea of really taking the soul seriously and returning to this Greek idea that psyche is soul. Like, it is the same concept. The word psyche in Greek is their word for soul, but it also has to do with mind. It also has to do with, this sense of being a subjective being with an intellect and an inner verse and all of these things. That's all part of being an ensouled, rational being. And that's a great idea. But how does depth psychology then lead to a felt sense of that rather than like, here's an idea? How do you go into a felt sense of being an
Hmm.
ensouled being rather than just talking about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I've had folks come to me and basically be like, teach me depth psychology, and uh, on the one hand, it's like, all right, how much time do you have? Like, grad school for almost 3 years, like barely gave me a foothold. But what I often tell people who want to kind of learn more about mythopoetic work or depth psychological work or Jungian work or whatever is like, the only way to learn it is to experience it. The only way to kind of, that's why Jungian analysts, when they're training, have to be in analysis for years
Mhm.
receiving it, because otherwise there's no real understanding of what we're talking about without taking your soul, your psyche, and putting it on the table, and usually that's done through dreams, through kind of the struggles and twists and turns of life. That is all it. It's not separate from it. And I think that's was kind of the first big shift for me in this tradition, is like, it's not, yes, there's heaps and heaps of books and ideas and theories, right? And I mean, and even Jung himself was like, theories are horrible, theories are the worst, because he understood that it's only through direct experience that we really come to a legitimate understanding. So that's the first thing I'll say, is like really being in it and doing your own work, whether if that's through dreams or other things. you know um I happen to look at psychedelic work as part of it as well,
Yeah.
and have really kind of focused on that side of things, because psychedelic, like you said, psyche means soul, and delos means to reveal or make manifest.
Mm-hmm.
So people often say psychedelic means mind manifesting, which it doesn't. It means soul revealing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And these are two very different directions, right, to go in. So it's kind of why, I spent so much time, writing this book about psychedelics and the soul, because I believe that depth psychology and psychedelics are kind of these two powerful tools that, especially when used together, um, can really help us encounter that reality of the soul, which doesn't have to be a individualized thing, can also be a collective thing, which I've seen kind of unfold time and time again in group psychedelic experiences, where the soul is able to kind of be in the room, and you can feel it when it happens.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I want to go there, but I will admit, I'm sure I've said this before, but for how much I talk about Jung and this whole tradition, I will readily admit that I have not done analysis. I have not done Jungian style, depth psychology style analysis with a professional. And I wonder for you, you mentioned that if you're going to go into that line of work, gain that expertise, you're not doing it unless you have it done to you. And I'm curious I'm assuming you probably had experience with psychedelics before that or no?
Yeah, I
Did
kind of found my way to psychology by way of psychedelics.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So that gives you kind of an interesting context to enter inner space with that people who had not had those experiences wouldn't have. So there's probably a separate question in here, but first, in your own, and obviously it's up to you how gory you want to get with the details or specific you want to get with your own personal experience. But I'm curious for you what analysis was like. And if you could speak a little bit to, again, what's the difference between traditional therapy and Jungian analysis? Because that's another one of those things that I
hmm
don't think a lot of people have a good sense of.
Yeah. I should say also, I've never done traditional Jungian analysis in the sense of going in multiple times a week
Okay.
for years on end. Traditionally, Jungian analysis is like 2 to 3 times a week for years.
Hmm.
I haven't done that. I've worked with a Jungian analyst and supervisor who's been more of a mentor to me for almost 5 years now, but we don't meet multiple times a week. Uh, but yeah, I mean, it's also, I think, a lot of experiential activities we did during my grad school training, and really kind of other forms of mythopoetic work with people who I wouldn't really call Jungians, but people from the mythopoetic
Hmm.
uh, movement, so to speak. People like Michael Mead and Martin Shaw being kind of the main two who I've spent time around. Um, it is a felt thing. It is a felt thing, and often, um, I think so many of the problems and the disconnects come from being so sort of isolated in the mind. And Jung was the first person to say, that we as modern Western people are really lacking in what he called the feeling function.
Hmm.
We're really good at thinking, right? But feeling and intuition are kind of these sort of uh, discarded stepchildren in our
Yeah,
culture that are essential functions. And I think depth psychology, when it's being done well, helps us get more in touch with those two things.
for sure. For sure. So
I
what
don't
do
know
you
if I
think?
answered your question.
Yeah, well, I was asking what did doing analysis reveal for you? But if you didn't do it in the traditional way and don't want to speak to that, that's totally cool. Um, but I was curious on a related note, what do you think psychedelics add to that equation? Because this idea, like this is what I've run into, in doing a lot of Jung or depth psychology related content, is that I think people have this sense that the ideas really connect. When you talk about something like the shadow, when you talk about, and we should talk a little bit too about Jung's conception of the psyche and what its sort of anatomy is.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
because I think that that's just, like I was just saying, it brings a lot of insight just by incarnating and labeling these parts that we, I think, innately may sense or not know what to call. Um, so let's do that. But also beneath that, there's some kind of experience or some way of trying to make these ideas not abstract and phenomenologically experienced. And that's one of those things that I really look to psychedelics for, because
Mm-hmm.
it's not there. One of the things that really irks me, I think, about, we were already beating up on, the modern social media flavor of spirituality and the new age vibe a little bit. And one of the things that irks me about it is that it's this very surface level idea that is pitching a nebulous spiritual force that you can use for materialistic gain. And there's not really anything provided in terms of having that rich phenomenological experience that you and I are interested in. Like, and to make that as straightforward as possible, a felt sense of, I do have a soul. I am living in a spiritual reality, despite how conditioned I am to think of everything in materialistic, terms. And the road to get to that place is very mysterious, and really, I think a lot of people listening are like, I just don't even feel that exists, and I don't
Mm-hmm.
know how to get there. And how is reading Jung or thinking about these things going to bring me to that place? And that's one of the great things about psychedelics, is that you don't have to read anything, you don't have to do anything, you just gotta ingest it or administer it, and you're going to go to some places that you didn't even know existed.
Yeah. I mean, I think something coming to me, just in this conversation in general, Michael, is like the role that elders and
Yeah.
mentorship plays in all of this, whether if it is kind of like speaking to the hollowness of New Age spirituality, where kind of everyone is an enlightened being or leader and everyone has authority, right? Or whether if it's sort of our kind of current culture of social media, stardom, where like anyone can be an authority on anything. Um, Whether if it's the psychedelic kind of world right now, where kind of people are just kind of marketing themselves as whatever they want with very little training, very little kind of uh, road time spent,
Hmm.
actually learning from people, and the same with depth psychology. Thankfully, the depth tradition does have this sort of built-in mentorship uh, function to it. You have to be connected to elders who've been practicing. I've been meeting with a guy who's been practicing, you know, uh, in the field of psychology for longer than I've been alive,
Hmm.
you know, and so I think we really need that in our culture, in all of these domains, whether if it's a sort of spiritual pursuit or a vocation, definitely in the realm of psychedelics, so I'll just say that. I mean, that's really, I
Hmm.
think, important to me, and something that to me has helped transmit that felt sense,
Yeah.
because otherwise we're just sort of playing in what Robert Bly called the sibling society, where
Mm.
we're kind of looking horizontally
Yeah.
to each other
Hmm.
for kind of validation of this sort of, let's call it a spiritual reality, or a kind of deeper esoteric truth as to who we are and what existence is, we're looking kind of to our peers to validate that, which I don't
Right.
actually think is how it's supposed to go. I think there's a verticality that is necessary in human cultures, that we're actually looking to the elders, and the elders are looking towards the youth to kind of bless and confirm their experiences. This is the role of initiation. you know
Right. That,
is
yeah.
that the youth or the initiate is blessed by the ritual elder, who's been there, who is like, yeah, yeah, you get it, you just got it, you saw the thing. you know Whereas all we kind of really have now is like this strange sort of like echo chamber of you know illusion, and the blind leading the blind, or rather the uninitiated initiating the uninitiated.
Yeah. Yeah, man. Yeah. These like pseudo initiations are going on all over the place. That's a really good point. What one thing we didn't really answer that I do want to press on you again for is the difference between the depth psychological approach, the goals of that approach
Mm,
versus a more standard kind of therapy
yeah,
that you're going to get on,
for sure.
well, not to beat up on any apps or whatever, because I think any kind of therapy is probably a good thing. But I do think that could be confusing because maybe somebody watches a video on Jung, like maybe right after this, maybe they watch the video on the shadow I did or whatever, and they're like, "Wow, I want to do this," and then they go get a therapist, and that therapist is not like, maybe they're loosely aware of these ideas, but it's not what they're trained to do, and they don't
Hmm.
know where that leads or how to really do that work. So yeah, just riff on that, please.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. I mean, most therapists and most therapy programs do not teach Jung. He's kind of this sort of pariah figure in psychology because our culture doesn't know what to make of him. And I think our culture doesn't know what to make of him is because he is, like I said, going back to that kind of archaeological analogy. He's digging to like a deeper strata
Hmm.
of the culture and the psyche than mainstream psychology would really like to address. Because I would say, a lot of kind of mainstream, or let's call it behavioral psychology, or you know most kind of accessible forms of psychology are actually oriented around kind of making us feel better so that we can go back to being productive members of society.
Right.
It's like, what do you mean you're depressed? Let's fix that depression and just get you back into the office. That's like the DSM is all oriented around sort of functionality. How
Right.
functional are you? And I think there's like a deep question there of like, uh, functional for what?
Right.
And I think Jung and depth psychology actually goes there of like, yeah, maybe the idea isn't to sort of fix your depression so you can go back to your job that crushes your soul. Maybe that's actually not what we're doing here, you know. Um, so there's, yeah, I mean, I could like go down a road about kind of like the mental health industrial complex, and how
Yeah.
concerning that is. But I
Well,
think what I'll just, yeah, go
I was
ahead.
going to say, let's talk a little bit about praxis. Like what the practical approach that someone like you would take to working with someone versus what we were talking about before, where it's a more they're going to be way more likely to use defined psychological, pathological terminology, and work around you know anxiety, depression, trauma, and of course these things are not mutually exclusive. It's not like
Hmm.
this language doesn't crosstalk or whatever. But how would you classify that difference, and how do you approach working with clients in a little more of
Hmm.
a way that we can sink our teeth into as listeners and understand?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if we're talking about praxis and tools and techniques, um, I think the OG technique is dream work.
Hmm.
So I'll often ask clients to bring me dreams. Some people are really great at it and always, have incredible dreams, and some, don't. So that's definitely one way that I'll kind of enter into this work with people. And the dreams, dreams are great because dreams don't lie. Dreams like always tell the truth, and sometimes the truth that the dream is revealing is a really hard pill to swallow, or something that is indwelling in the psyche but not yet known. That's kind of, I would say, like the foundational direction of depth psychology. It's like, what is indwelling in you that you
Hmm.
don't consciously know? And it's not actually for me to determine like where we're going.
Interesting.
It's not for me to determine like, should you go back to your desk job that you hate or not. Like, that's not for me to decide. I like to say that, and the same goes for psychedelic facilitation work, is like, we just hold the frame, but we don't determine what comes into the picture. And so much of depth psychological work to me is about holding that frame. And that can happen through dream work, and the dream paints the picture. I also do a lot of work with IFS, or internal family systems,
Hmm.
which I think is a really useful tool for doing this work. I don't look at IFS as the be all end all. I will say there's a lot of kind of like hype around
Yeah, yeah.
the model recently, which, for better or worse, but to me, it's like a way of going into someone's process, oftentimes through using kind of what Jungians would call active imagination. It's
Hmm.
the same thing. We're going into the psyche and letting the psyche kind of speak for itself. And IFS uses this language of parts. And to me, there's sometimes archetypal traces, or like
Oh yeah.
scents or flavorings that certain parts have. It doesn't mean that the part is an archetype, but there's an energy there often.
Yeah.
So that's another way I'll work with people. um and then, the psychedelic work is kind of like,
The
the
advanced.
yeah, it's sort of the next level of
Yeah.
putting it all together. And yeah, so that's what I'll say.
Yeah, those are all good meaty rabbit holes in their own right. I don't know if we said so IFS is internal family systems. It's not it's very adjacent to what we're talking about in that what you're doing is, as the name would suggest, you're basically incarnating these different parts of your psyche and giving them names, giving them voices. You're identifying the things they want, what they're exerting in your psyche, how that's manifesting in your everyday reality, and you're working to, in a very similar way to active imagination, you're working to identify these needs in your psyche that may not be being met, so that there might be this unseen kind of, at least in the lens of IFS, this like unseen agent who is making you, or maybe not making, but is exerting this control over your psyche and actions that is probably undesirable, but and you haven't really figured out a way to identify that or communicate with that. So that's the sort of, from my understanding, the sort of overarching idea of internal family systems, and it's really interesting. I talked to Dick Schwartz a long time ago at this point,
Mm.
but yeah, he's a really really interesting guy, and
Yeah, very
his
kind
yeah,
dude.
his method is, it seems like it's absolutely blown up. It's interesting. um and to your point, man, it also, not only with depth psychology, but it fits in really really well, I would think, with psychedelic work. And I don't know how you've seen that, those two pieces fit together. But before we go there, we brush up against this idea of Jung's model of the psyche and the sort of
Hmm.
anatomy of the psyche. And I think that's a really really important idea and map to be
Yeah.
aware of, that there are these different layers of psyche. And squaring the circle between what is my psyche and what is psyche at large is always an interesting dance to do, because I think the more you go down this path, you start to realize that there I don't want to say that dualistic picture is false, because I don't think it's exactly false, but I do think there's some kind of porous relationship. Like there is
Hmm.
absolutely some kind of very, I guess, platonic, in a platonic sort of way, your soul and the world's soul, just like it says in the Platonic dialogues, just like it says in the Timaeus, are made of
Hmm.
the exact same substance.
Hmm.
And I think Jung not only realized that, but he elucidated that in a much more practical way for 20th century human beings, and up to our day, in a way that really nobody else has, at least for me. Um, so yeah, do you want to riff on the sort of general anatomy of the Jungian psyche and why you think it's important?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, visually, I'm a really visual person, so I love
Mm-hmm.
the kind of map, that you're speaking of. But yeah, for people listening, like the way to conceive of this thing is sort of um, uh, overlapping and somewhat concentric circles with, let's say, if you were to sort of take a big circle, draw a line through the middle of it horizontally, and then kind of have a center point in that, right in the middle of that. That's what Jung and also Dick Schwartz and IFS calls the self with a capital S. It's kind of this like innate core or the soul, we could call it. Um, but Jung calls it the self. And then above that, sort of everything on the top side of that circle is kind of the outer world, right? And everything below that is the inner world. And on the top side of it, we have kind of this sphere, this circle that is basically ego consciousness, and a little bit of that is underneath the line because we have a personal unconsciousness.
Right.
And then at the top of the ego, we have like another layer, which Jung would call the persona, which is sort of our image that we project out into the world. And then we have kind of, Freud's idea of the superego would be like outside of the entire circle, kind of influencing us, society, right? Um, our life context, everything outside is outside of that circle on the top because it's all in the outer world. Below that line in the middle, we have a little bit of the ego in the unconscious. And then we have a deeper kind of well of the collective unconscious, um, which is kind of what we, let's say, tap into when we go to these sort of deeper realms of the soul. And then beneath that, we have kind of the archetypal realm, these things that are actually outside of us that can enter in through the things like the collective unconscious. Down in there also there's another little overlapping circle that I would say touches the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, which is the shadow.
Yeah.
And I often like to say that the shadow is a place, not a thing, and it kind of lives in this borderland between our personal unconscious, our personal shadow, right? All the stuff we're personally kind of unaware of or maybe don't identify with, but we actually do, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a collective layer to the shadow as well. um, and then at the very bottom of all of that is like kind of more almost esoteric or metaphysical concepts like the archetypes. We could go even further and say like, you know, I mean, in certain traditions, right, we would put the gods somewhere around
Yeah,
there. Um, so yeah, I hope that kind
it
of makes
does.
sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'll definitely put the graphic up on the screen as you're describing all of those things. And one of the things that doing a deeper dive into the whole Hellenistic and largely like Western esoteric sort of corpus um, has done for me, especially after reading Jung, is confronting the obvious similarities between their concepts of the cosmos and Jung's concept of the psyche.
Hmm.
Because if you look at like the Ptolemaic or the or even just the sort of Platonic hypostases, or like even the Gnostic ones to some degree. Though the Gnostic ones and the later Platonic ones tend to get very, very busy with all these different,
Mm-hmm.
metaphysical, what the Platonists would call intelligibles or archetypes or eidos or whatever. Um, the basic idea is the same. And the basic idea is that you have this locus of familiar selfhood sort of somewhere in the center. And then there are these concentric circles, like you described, where there's like maybe there's spheres of different archetypes or planetary archetypes or um, realities like hypostases or whatever. And it's impossible not to be like, it seems at some point humans were innately conflating the physical cosmos with their psychological reality. And that isn't to say that the psychological or the imaginal is any less real. It's just that we were taking the inside for the outside in a way that probably is not literal. And we were probably doing more mapping of the intelligible realm or the psychological realm than we were of the outside, at least at certain points in history. And that idea is very, very fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, though I'm also open to the idea that the physical cosmos are not what they seem to be, and that there really may be other powers, other consciousnesses out there. I think that that's totally plausible. But I think it's such an important idea to understand that, or at least to entertain, that there are these different, I like your use of the word places. Like there are these different sorts of, or I don't know, maybe it's, maybe I won't glad hand you and say maybe I don't, maybe I'm not sure about places because it implies like a somewhereness, right? It's a whatever it is, it's a quality that you can experience and that you can find yourself in. And as a side note, that's one of the reasons I really like the structure of your book, because it's structured around these archetypes of both quality, where you can intellectually understand it, but you can also experience. You can also be
Mm-hmm.
like, I am in a tree of life experience. I
Mm-hmm.
am in an underworld experience, in a sense that very much does feel like a place that you are. But it's
Mm-hmm.
also like not in physical space. So it's so confusing to try to understand how to think about it, even conceptually. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's sort of some of that conflation that we're seeing between Jung's model of the psyche, more ancient maps of the cosmos. Um, but I guess, yeah, maybe to actually throw a question in here, how do you conceive of that? Like, if you do call it a place, if you do call the shadow a place, in what sense? Like,
Mm-hmm.
where is it? Like,
Yeah.
how do you arrive there?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, how do you arrive there? Usually through a lot of discomfort, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Especially if we're talking about the shadow. I don't think, I often like to say, shadow work, genuine shadow work, is about the last thing that any sane person would want to post about on Instagram.
Right.
It's not glamorous, it's not sexy, it's not like um I don't even know if it's cool. Like it's pretty not yeah, it's extremely uncomfortable, and I've often heard it said that we can't really know our shadow. It's usually what like the people closest to us, partners, friends, whatever, kind of turn to us and are like, do you know that you like kind of do this thing sometimes? Or like sometimes when I do this, like you do this thing. And it's like,
Hmm,
fuck,
hmm.
I do. I totally do.
Yeah.
That is our shadow. Or when there's such a sort of strong projection, usually like strong projection or emotion about a person, we're projecting kind of all the disowned parts of ourselves onto that person. Um, So to me, that's like how we know we're kind of in shadow terrain, or in a psychedelic experience, it's kind of yeah, experiencing like horrific things, or torturous imagery, or just
Yeah.
like those awful experiences, where like that I don't think about like whatever, like sacrificing animals all the
Right,
time.
right.
Like, why was I having all this imagery of this horrific? It's like, well, that's in there somewhere, you know?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So that's what I mean. It's like, it's a place we go to, but it's not a thing. It's like people talk about the shadow a
Yeah.
lot. Like it's this sort of like big, scary man in like a trench coat. And it's like,
Hmm.
no,
Hmm.
it's a place. It's a place, not a thing.
Interesting. Because on that specific note, Jung did say that the shadow, if you're a man, for instance, the shadow will appear as a man to you
Right.
in dreams. And the, I can get down with that. But at the same time, I much more agree with what you're saying, that it's like this, it's this archetypal, I don't know if I want to say Saturnian. It has Saturnian elements, but the reason I was laughing before, on a related note, when you were talking about, experiencing these dark realities, and it's so comes to the forefront in a psychedelic experience. But to tell an extremely unflattering story, I was laughing because on the first night of the one and only ayahuasca retreat I did, sometimes the shadow looks like you being stripped nearly naked or naked by people who you've placed your trust in, because you were having such a crazy breakdown that you need to be rinsed off in a shower to try to like calm yourself down somehow. And sometimes it looks like sitting down in that shower and peeing yourself in front of said strangers.
Yeah.
And if you're not willing to go to that level of, maybe not really doing shadow work, then maybe not to say what anyone needs to experience or needs to do or where they need to go. But for me, that was a reality. And getting to that place of being, not just ego annihilation in that like, whoa, I cease to exist during this trip, but really having the felt sense of rock bottomness that can come with those kinds of experiences. I mean, that might sound like a why the fuck would you ever want to do that? But when it's only like one step in the work that you're doing and you can rebuild a new framework from that point of rock bottomness, it's like one of the most powerful transformative experiences you can possibly have.
Hmm.
And that speaks a little bit to the importance, I think, of why you would want to do this, why you would want to go into these dark places of feeling insignificant, feeling, just pitiful, disgusting, pointless, useless. All of these fears that that we have somewhere within ourselves that we want to not focus in on for obvious reasons. But when you do, and I don't even want to say you release them, because I'm not sure that it's you're releasing them, but you're at least really confronting them and you're really allowing their reality to just consume you for a time. And then in being consumed and regrowing from that pile of excrement or whatever, there's something really beautiful that can come out of that.
Yeah. And I think part of what I'm also hearing you speak to, Michael, is the value of the underworld journey.
Yes.
And you know, it's the longest chapter in my book is devoted to the underworld, because it is such a ubiquitous part of myth, you know, um, and it is such a frequent occurrence for people, at least from what I've seen, in psychedelic work, is kind of visiting this underworld place. Um, that is almost, to me, like if we're staying with that kind of like visual metaphor of the map of the psyche, it's almost like a little portal or doorway
Yeah.
in that shadow circle that goes to somewhere entirely different, that I would say is archetypal, you know, and also, is kind of essential in any, I think, kind of genuine form of inner work, which is again like why I really don't buy the sort of white clothing, ascensional, kind of new age uh, stuff, is because there's no room for the underworld.
Right.
And I think some of the most powerful experiences I've had in life, I'm not even talking in a psychedelic way, in life, have come from that descent, or what you called earlier, when we were chatting, a katabasis,
Yeah,
this
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
descent into descent to soul, really, is what we could call it. And I think, yeah, there's a sort of ancient key there that, might be kind of, again, part of why psychedelics and part of why depth psychology, are valuable, and kind of making this resurgence right now. I don't know about depth psychology, but psychedelics certainly so, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. The underworld will not be denied. And the underworld is here, I think. And I think that's one of the other insights that going into these more mythopoetic ways of seeing gives you is that all of these archetypes, they're not, we're talking about place, like where are they? Well, they're here. But your perception of them being here may be completely vestigial or something. Like you may not feel them consciously, but I promise you they're showing up in dreams. I promise you it's somewhere in your unconscious. And but this idea of the underworld is a really complicated one. It's kind of like the shadow itself, where it gets conflated with only darkness, only grossness, only hell. We think of the underworld now as hell, like synonymous with hell basically. But the underworld in tradition in the Hellenistic culture and in probably many other cultures is not that. It's just the other side. It's like the other realm. Like sometimes in the Greek tradition and the Hellenistic tradition, they would literally portray it as upside down version of this world. Um, I'm guessing Stranger Things stole that. You know how they have the
Hmm.
upside
Hmm.
down. Um, but yeah, and you also notice, and I'm taking this from classicists who I've heard and read say this. I don't know this is for sure, but they say that if you read the whole corpus of literature, there is no ascent journey at first. It's all everyone's going to the underworld. Like Orpheus goes to the underworld, Persephone goes to the
Hmm.
underworld. The pre-Socratic philosopher who also has the Platonic dialogue. I can't.
Parmenides.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, he goes to some kind of.
Hmm.
I believe he goes to the underworld, if
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah, he visits
mistaken.
Persephone and
Right,
brings
right.
back all of his philosophical understandings from Persephone, according to
Yeah,
him.
yeah, yeah. So this is where you went for knowledge. This is where you went to commune with gods seemingly for on up until suddenly this ascent motif
Hmm.
is introduced. And whether that's true or not, let's just even say it's not true. It is an important thing that was recognized by our ancestors at some point. And not only that, but that's literally what these seers, mystics, shamans would do. They would go, so this word katabasis, it means going down, and they would literally go into caves or into darkness. Um, and Tibetan yogis still do this too, these darkness retreats where they'll stay in the dark for extended
Hmm.
periods of time. And you learn shit in there.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
things, the mind definitely, or the psyche is definitely manifested or revealed in that darkness in a way that we've lost touch with. And I
Hmm.
think we're actively afraid of. But that's one of the amazing things, again, about a psychedelic experience is that you can, I'm not saying it's one to one, because like I said, I have not had that experience, but it will absolutely take you to those places in a much shorter amount of time
Hmm.
than, sitting in the dark for days on end or something. But yeah, this underworld motif, what do you make of it, and what does it mean practically, do you think, for somebody who's trying to understand this stuff now?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I love that question. I think it's kind of the archetypal counterpoint to the last 2,000 years,
Wow.
which has been all about ascension and has been all about up and out. And now, we're talking about going to whatever other planets and like all this stuff. Great, wonderful. And I think the fallout of that ascensional perspective has been the complete destruction of our planet. And it's interesting that the underworld is always down and in. It's always in the earth. It's very much of the earth. And the word I like to use is thonic. There's
Yeah.
a thonic intelligence and a thonic knowing that is transmitted to those who venture down. And I think that kind of thonic knowing, I write about it, in my book, but it's the kind of wisdom and gravitas that cannot be bought, cannot be sort of instilled from like a weekend workshop, cannot be sort of performed. You know, uh, you know it when you feel it, and the only way that you know it is by being in it. And there's a gravitas to certain people also who like, I'll just say like, there's no need for psychedelics to induce this. You spoke of like darkness retreats. I've met plenty of teachers in the world of mythology and other traditions that have a lot of underworld knowledge to them, and they're not into psychedelics, but their lives have been very informed and sort of carved and sculpted by the underworld because
Yeah.
they've lost a lot. They've
Yeah.
lost a lot. They've suffered a lot. And yeah, I think that um, there's a really essential quality of humility that also comes through these experiences, which to me, Jung also talked a lot about. Part of the goal of his work and the goal of kind of any, depth psychological work is what he called relativizing the ego and the soul,
Mm.
kind of bringing the two back into an alignment
Hmm.
rather than the ego just running the show and getting us into all sorts of, you know, quote, mental health problems,
Yeah.
right? When the ego and the soul are in a balanced and right relationship, then we're kind of living a full and honest human life.
Yeah.
And I think the only way to bring the soul kind of back out of its exile is to have that relationship of going down and in, because that's where we find it.
Yeah. Yeah, man. Yeah, you said such an important word there, full. And I think that there's something that the soul is badly crying out for, and we mistake it for being that ascension, that understanding, that uh, you know, becoming something more than what we are, or enlightenment or whatever. And I don't think while you're in these underworld spaces, you're enjoying it. I mean, I certainly am not was not fucking enjoying what I was just describing before, nor did I enjoy 95% of that retreat in terms of the work that was being done under the influence of ayahuasca. But what I will say is I experienced in that retreat, there's a reason that every single mythological motif, and more largely mythopoetic motif of you got to go down to go up, you got to putrefy to create the philosopher's stone, you've got to I could start listing off examples. The
Hmm.
myth of from Plato's Republic. What happens when the souls die? They go to the underworld. Then something happens and they're parsed, and then some go up. And that, or in, like I said, in alchemy, the first step of the great work is the nigredo and putrefaction and all of this stuff, and then you move on from there to albedo, etc. Um, and it's the same in actual mystery initiations. Seemingly, it's always a death and rebirth motif, and you really have to go through actual confusion and terror that is not metaphorical, and is not like, oh, I'm going through a haunted house right now, this is, and just knowing it's not that. It's genuinely confusing and terrifying. I
Hmm.
don't remember where I was reading this, but I was just reading about um there was part of the Eleusinian mysteries where you were specifically made to be very confused and go through like dark areas and be terrified. And
Hmm.
there's also another mystery initiation cult. It's a katabasis cult, and I'm forgetting the name of it, but you would literally go down into this like pitch black area and be like pulled through a hole and all of this stuff. And they called it was like a terrif like an initiation where being terrified was a large part of it. They were like genuinely scaring you.
Yeah.
And not to mention the more ordeal based initiations where you really could die. Like you really could.
Oh yeah.
um Joseph Campbell talks about one of them. It's a Native American warrior initiation where it's just like, hooks go through your
Mm.
body and you're suspended from the ceiling and
Oh,
you're dragged
the
around.
Okipa ceremony.
Okay. Yeah.
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 What,
Hmm.
so, I mean, I'm already kind of, I guess, spoiling the answer, but why do you think it's so important to really go to those dark dimensions in a way that cannot be spiritually bypassed, and you seriously have to confront your own limitations, mortality, death?
I think because that is where, yeah, it's, the number one sort of sin in the classical Greek world is hubris against the
Yeah.
gods,
Yeah.
you know? And I think it's those experiences that sort of are a preventative for that kind of way of being. And I think we're seeing a lot of hubris against the gods in
Oh
our
yeah.
world, which is why things are kind of the way they are, uh, because we don't have that tempering of the soul or tempering of the ego and its pride, you know? Um, and I also think there's a kind of gratitude for life that comes after those experiences. Um, uh, yeah, I would like to think that it helps us open our hearts to each other more.
Yeah.
Um, and especially today where there's so much uh, ideology and divisiveness. And, I've lost a lot of friends, as I'm sure a lot of people have over the last 5 years, where it's just like, wow, damn, like I don't remember that really happening before, you know, 2020, basically. And, I think it's really easy to close our hearts because it's protective, it's safe. But, I think that descent to soul and being able to humble ourselves, and again, like different traditions have so many different ways of doing this, you know um but it helps us kind of be better community members, have more of a capacity for the other, right? Be able to embrace paradox more, right? Like, okay, like we're ideologically different, but I can still love you. I can
Mhm.
still tolerate you in my life, even though you don't perfectly conform to every ideology I have. Right. I think that's kind of like essential to part of our survival,
Oh
you
yeah.
know? Um, and yeah, I mean, the whole section at the end of my chapter on the underworld is, I try to give skills at the end of each chapter, for would be facilitators or psychedelic
Hmm.
therapists. And I got to the end of the underworld chapter, and I was like, there are no skills for this. Like, there's no magic tools. There's no like abracadabra. Like, you're on your own. But here are, 4 or 5 different kind of signposts to let you know where you are. If you find yourself in an underworld experience, here are like
Yeah.
4 or 5 qualities to that place. And paradox is the first one, and I think having those experiences just kind of help us be more open-hearted, available, and mature human beings.
I wonder if that paradox that you were speaking to might be what they're alluding to in that trope in all of those underworld stories. I know this is for sure in the Orpheus story, where you know how the like, okay, we'll let you go this one time, but don't look back. Don't.
Right.
And in the in
You
the
just have to do
Persephone,
it.
yeah, and in the Persephone story, it's like you can't eat anything but the pomegranate seed or whatever. I don't know if that triggers anything for you, but that just immediately popped into my mind in a way where I thought I better throw that into the conversation.
Yeah. Well, it's often it's like it's the thing that is kind of God, there's a term for it that I've heard. I think I remember Martin Shaw writing about this in one of his books. It happens in fairy tales all the time. And it's this same kind of mythic motif where it's like, whatever you do, don't do this one thing.
Right.
And it's that one thing that sort of catalyzes all of the trouble of the story. And it's essential. Like nothing, there would be no story without that kind of transgressing of like, whatever you do, don't eat that red flower. Whatever you do, don't look back, and it's almost kind of like this human part of our nature to be like, I have to push the button that I can't push.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess it's the forbidden fruit motif, right? Because by eating something or doing something or acknowledging something, you're breaking some kind of barrier. Like you're like that's definitely part of the Persephone eating the pomegranate myth, is that once you eat the food of that world, you are of that world and you can't just come and go anymore now. And there's a lot of clearly the Garden of Eden story, but also in a lot of mystery cults, there's a very similar idea. And there's reasons like you don't eat certain foods. Like this was at least among some sects of like Platonists and Pythagoreans. There's a vegetarian diet. You definitely didn't eat meat, but there's other stuff that was impure or forbidden. And some of the reasons for that are not spelled out and they're esoteric reasons. But have you ever heard about the Pythagorean story with the beans?
No.
So for whatever reason, beans were outlawed by Pythagoreans, and the Pythagorean initiation is like notoriously insane. It's you read about it and you think, could it have really been this crazy? It was something like before you were even the very first rank, it was like a 5-year, 10-year period of silence or some shit like that. Just really crazy, strict things. But one of them is there's these impure foods you don't eat, and one of them is beans for some reason. And there's all this speculation about why beans. Is it
maybe it disrupts the silence?
Yeah, right. Yeah, the farting. Like, yeah, it's like impure vapors or something. I don't know, but yeah, there's a story about because there was a time in history where Pythagoreans were politically powerful enough that they actually ruled certain areas, and they were I wish I could remember the story better, but basically all you need to know is there's a group of Pythagoreans who are fleeing from, I think that they were Romans, but I could be wrong. But anyway, they're fleeing and they hit like a bean field and they just stop and give up. And the Romans or whoever it is pursuing them starts laughing, and they're like, you're so brainwashed that you won't even pass through this field of beans, because they understood that they would not eat the beans, but they didn't understand why. So they demand to be told, like, what is it about the beans? Like, why won't you eat them? And the guy's like, I can't tell you. I've taken a vow to not tell you. So he goes and gets the guy's wife and threatens to kill the wife and says, I will kill your wife if you don't tell me. The wife bites off her own tongue before before telling. Yeah, it's like that's the story at least. So yeah, I mean, that's just an interesting side story that I'm not sure that adds anything to the conversation about not eating certain foods, or but that's the level. I mean, that was at least to illustrate the level of seriousness one is supposed
Right.
to have when living, um, I don't know, a life of philosophic or spiritual seeking that one needs to be willing to go to at times.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm struck by the level of devotion and seriousness of that, like what's behind that, and yeah, when I think about our kind of cultural climate today, it's really hard to find, at least for me, I don't know, it's increasingly hard to find levels of sincerity and
Yes,
conviction that feel authentic to me,
right.
that feel compelling enough to be like, wow, I will follow you, or listen to you talk, or whatever. Like, I'm here for whatever is going on with this person or thing. You know, uh, that's very hard to find. And hearing that story about kind of the level of initiatory depth and sincerity that some of these kind of ancient, I guess we could call the Pythagoreans like a sort of ancient society of mystics, right?
Yeah, for sure.
A
Yeah.
mystical brotherhood, so to speak. The level of devotion, and not just sort of blind devotion, but initiatory understanding,
Yeah.
that would, create a story like that is profound.
Yes. Yeah, and I never fully appreciated, and I'm not saying I fully appreciate it now, but there, I never fully appreciated what was so compelling or powerful about, um, that way of living in the pursuit of wisdom and mathematical truth and initiatory truth and all of that stuff until very recently, and like having a little bit more of a sophisticated framework to understand those things. But one of the ideas that eventually, well, instead of going there, I want to ask you this, because we're starting, we're starting to do this inevitable thing that, at least, and maybe this just is an artifact of the way that I talk and the things that I talk about, but it goes from psychological to absolutely spiritual and metaphysical. And I wonder if, this exploration of depth psychology for you has changed your own understanding metaphysically of what the human condition is, what human life is, why we're here, what we're doing, where we're going. Has depth psychology changed those thoughts for you, or?
I don't know about changed, more so just opened.
Hmm,
I feel like depth psychology more like opened a way rather than kind of gave me an answer, if that makes sense.
yeah,
And I mean, one thing that I've been reflecting on recently, I've been doing a lot of writing on my Substack about kind of vetting and sussing out psychedelic guides or facilitators, and kind of like how to sort of detect or spot like
yeah,
charlatans and bullshitters, basically. One of the things that happened when I started getting, uh, you know, when I started going to grad school, basically, and studying depth psychology sincerely, was that kind of any um, new agey or ungrounded or kind of wishy-washy kind of spiritual material, new agey stuff, or even someone who kind of like wants to kind of like tell me the way it is without
hmm,
any kind of consent or
right, right,
discussion. I'm sure you've encountered those people who kind of like want to give you their sort of like hot take on the way it
oh
is. It's
yeah,
like, I didn't really ask. Anything like that, I just noticed I started rapidly losing capacity for. And I don't know why, but I feel like it had depth psychology. and the tradition of Carl Jung had a big role to play in that. Um, I think there's a level of kind of lineage and gravitas there that like is extremely grounding for me, and extremely grounding in this sort of swirling miasma of ideologies and
Yeah.
political beliefs and like whatever is unfolding and clearly being amplified and manipulated by social media and the internet, right? Jung, myth, depth psychology all kind of gave me a like an anchor to not feel so buffeted around by this swirling insanity that I've seen really take down people I know. You know, I've seen people really go down hard, um, because of the ideological warfare that is unfolding rapidly in our culture. So to me, that's like just first line of like of basic kind of grounding in something that feels weighty and strong enough to be like, yeah, I'm not really swayed too easily.
Right.
um, I'm not blown around by the wind. It's a root. It's like a tree with strong roots is what I feel like the depth tradition has given me. And I don't know about like the meaning of life or anything like
Hmm.
that, but that's just really served me, you
Yeah.
know. And I think the way that I got through, you know, a lot of COVID and just that time where there's so much crumbling apart, you know, and we're still kind of in that period, you know, right now, but it just gave me a profound respect and ability, to kind of just stay in my lane,
Yeah. That's a
and
great
and
answer.
that's really like helped me out, you know, because I love my lane and I don't need my lane to be everyone else's lane, and I don't like need to kind of impose my lane over others. It's not better or worse. It's just mine. And like,
Yeah.
that's all I need it to be. And if people want to like be in that lane with me, fantastic. But I don't need to prove anything about this to
Right.
anyone. And the same with psychedelics, you know, it's a little more of a curvy, weird, undefined lane, but
Yeah.
it's still, it's like, I'm not interested in trying to prove anything to anyone anymore. I was for a long time, but having kind of this sense of like a deep nourishing root, my nourishment, my spiritual nourishment and psychological, you know, energy comes from I hate to sound like arrogant or whatever, but like comes from a deeper place than like what is currently swirling around in our kind of collective consciousness right now.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I mean, you're in good company because, forget what I agree, but forget me. I was just talking to, the great Dr. Jeffrey Kripal, do you know him at all?
I know the name, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For
He's
sure. I
a
don't know his work well, but
philosopher of religion, but specifically interested in the mystical, high weirdness,
mhm.
psychedelics, near death experiences. He's written a not like I don't even really know how many books, more than 10. And
He's been in he's been like a voice
yes,
for a long time, like since the 60s, yeah? Is that right?
he's not that old.
Okay,
He is probably, I'm gonna guess, in his 50s maybe.
got it. Okay,
But he's currently the chairman of the board at Esalen too, so he's in
got it.
that whole community. But anyway, he said something very similar to what you said, and we were talking about this under a slightly different context, though. He's definitely sort of this next generation perennialist who's looking for the truth underneath the truth, kind of guy, and takes all traditions seriously but not literally. And he said something very similar in terms of like he stays in his own lane. He doesn't make judgments on things that he just doesn't have the expertise for or pretend that he does. Um, so I mean, I just completely agree with that sentiment. And I wish there was more of that kind of just lack of hubris. Because you can sense it on people, man. Like it's really clear when people seem like they're trying to prove something or trying to, I don't know, like intellectually or spiritually win someone over so that they can occupy some hierarchically superior space in their own minds that no one even
Mm.
gives a shit about. And I just think that's so important. But I do want to ask you again though, even if it's not to, you know, prove anything to anyone, or just to make it a little more direct. What is your sense of the metaphysical condition of the human being? What are your, do you have any strong convictions on that? Are you totally like uncertain and agnostic about it?
I think there's a reason that a lot of these initiatory traditions, whether, the Eleusinian mysteries or the Pythagoreans or whatever, are called mystery schools because it's a mystery. And to me, it's more like the Rilke sentiment of like living the questions.
Oh yeah, I love
And
that.
and to me, like there's just been traditions and people and texts and whatever that have just helped me better live the questions. And you know, that's for me. That's looked like time spent with a variety of different indigenous people and traditions. And
Hmm.
living the questions through that way. It's looked like a lot of time and devotion to depth psychology, which has helped me like better live the questions. It's looked like a really just like deeply reciprocal relationship with myth and mythopoetics that continues to just unfold. Every time I kind of get away from myth and mythopoetics, I come back, I feel like I'm like coming home.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, those stories like don't really give answers. They kind of like just help us better live the questions.
Right.
And yeah, so that's really what I can say. I don't really know if I have any answers for you there,
I
Michael.
respect, no, I respect that, man. I absolutely respect that. And I'm on the same page, I think. But I guess I would go personally a little bit stronger ontologically toward, I think there is something going on, playing out. And one of my favorite words that I learned from John Vervaeke is a Greek word, unsurprisingly, which is anagage, which is sort of it's similar to the ascent idea, but it's that there are these levels of realization and understanding and progressive sorts of steps one can make, but I believe that it's a directional thing, not a finished thing. It's sort of one of those journeys that sort of just continues on and continues on and continues on, where real progress can be made, but it's like, and it's very similar to individuation in that respect, is
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
there is a sort of light that one
Right.
goes toward, which you could think of as the capital S self, or the
Yeah.
soul, or whatever it is. But arriving there, at least in physical lifetimes, I'm not so sure. I would love to
Well,
be wrong about that, but
yeah, I mean, the word that I think about is telos or
yes,
direction.
exactly.
There's a
Yes.
telos to the psyche, there's a telos to the soul, there's a direction to these things. Um, and to me, it's just that's just one word for a lot of other what a lot of other traditions and myths have described with other language. Whether if it's the golden thread that kind of weaves through our
Hmm.
life, or I know I'm thinking about a story that I heard Michael Mead tell recently, a Russian folk tale of the firebird and this like red feather dropping from the firebird. It's like, what's the red feather? That kind of takes you on the journey, you know? So yes, absolutely. Or just like the idea that life simply wants more life, you
Mm.
know? Uh, Absolutely. I agree. I don't think we're just kind of amorphously floating around in this creation. There's definitely a telos and a direction. And
Yeah.
I think so often my work seems to be, at least when I work with people one on one, so much of that seems to be about helping people kind of get back to that telos or that direction for their life.
Right. Right. So something that blew my mind recently, and I want to know, I want to see if you've come across this yet, or if I can blow your mind with this too. Is so I was reading. I mentioned Professor Gregory Shaw to you. He wrote a book called Theurgy and the Soul, and it's largely about this Neoplatonic philosopher Iamblichus. And guess what phrase I encounter in there under the pretense of it being um, coming from Plato, or at least Aristotle. He might have said Aristotle. Principium individuationis is not from Jung. I did not know this until about 2 weeks ago. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because you're talking about this idea of personal telos, right? And personal directionality. And essentially, what is the purpose of the individual? What is it becoming? What is its end? What does it even mean to be an individual? This apparently is a well-defined concept brought up by Aristotle and is talked about in the context of like Neoplatonic um theurgy, but to not introduce that whole rabbit hole because it's such a deep one and nuanced one. Basically, this idea of what is the human soul here to do? What can it do? Um, my mind was kind of blown to learn that that's not a Jung original. I really thought it was. I really thought it was from that
Mhm.
passage in the Red Book.
Yeah. Well, again, deep roots, right?
Yes.
Deep roots that are being drawn upon. And it's interesting, I think the context for most of our conversation, Michael, has been in kind of this exploration of like the Western esoteric tradition, right? Everything from alchemy to Greek philosophy to Carl Jung, right?
It's probably my
It's
fault.
interesting thinking. I heard Joseph Campbell say something once, and he was talking about kind of the difference of the individual, the emphasis on the individual in Western societies versus Eastern societies. And he said that in the West, the core idea, the core telos in regards to this conversation is to become somebody.
Right.
And in the East, the core telos or idea is to become nobody. And I just find that like fascinating because I think that that's like a whole other side of the equation that
Yeah.
our culture has been trying to kind of integrate and grapple with, since Buddhism and Hinduism has really like collided with our kind of Western, journey of individuation. Is like, well, what about becoming nobody? To quote Ram Dass, like just dissolving.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a beautiful way to put it, and an elegant way to put it. And I had this in a little bit of a different context. Well, not even a different context, really. I had a whole psilocybin trip back in the day where I wrote all of these notes around what I was calling the theme of the cosmic yes. Just I was sort of feeling imbued with this. Yes, we're here for a reason. Life is here for a reason. We're going to be this. It's very much the sort of like McKennian and also kind of sci-fi, like psychedelic sci-fi vision of the future of the anima mundi helped us to get to this place where we can spread life and consciousness and psyche to other rocks that are currently bereft of it, and that's our job, and we're going to do this, and you just have to say yes to it. Yes, life is hard, there's going to be death, there's going to be suffering, but it's worth it, we're going to do it. And then toward the very end of the trip, I started having the much more Eastern take and be like, wait a minute, maybe it's the cosmic no. Maybe it's to realize that it's all futile. It's all like stop spinning your wheels. Just go the Buddhist route, become empty, become nobody. Um, but I still think the romance of the cosmic yes has me. I still think the idea of there is a purpose, there is something to do. You, Simon, in this incarnation is a thing your soul is doing and is working out on some kind of immortal level. It's like, I got to do this. I got to do this experience and work on that or something. I don't know what it is exactly, but some version of that still has a hold on me in a way that and maybe that's where my
Oh, me
limitations or
too.
my growth
Yeah,
is stunted.
me too. I mean, because we're of this culture,
Yeah.
and I think James Hillman once said, if you're speaking English, you're speaking Greek.
Ah.
Like where we are of the Western tradition, whether we want to be or not, and which also is like why I think I've seen a lot of people who get really deep into Buddhism get into a lot of kind of what to me looks like psycho spiritual trouble or
Mm.
like ontological meltdown, to an extent where I think their teachers are like, "Yay, this is good," but to me as their friend, I'm like, are you sure you're okay? I haven't heard from you in like a year and a half. Are you sure you're all right?
Yeah, I think I know
Yeah.
what you mean, but can you expand on that?
Oh, I think there's an ontological shock that I've seen occur with Westerners who want to really, really walk the Buddhist path in a way that, let's call it, is like highly traditional.
Like very self-nullifying, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah. They like delete themselves from the world, which is kind of the opposite to the idea of individuation, which is to become like a full, willing, conscious participant in the world. And Jung wrote somewhere, I love this. He said, the goal of individuation is not to kind of become more and more like disentangled from the world,
Mhm.
but to become even more like of a kind of willing participant in it
Yeah.
consciously, Um, so yeah, I think I've seen a lot of people struggle with that. And it's almost like it philosophically kind of creates a lot of friction and can lead to like some breakdowns, you know. And yeah, I'm not shitting on anyone's path or anything like that. It's more of just in this context of talking about individuation. How do we square kind of the Buddhist road? You know.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, preempt this by saying not trying to shit talk anyone, but Gregory Shaw, that same professor, one of the reasons I love him so much is because he talks about exactly what you're describing. He went hardcore ascetic yogi path for like 6 7 years, practicing every day, no romantic relationships, essentially just doing yoga all the time, eating a very austere diet, very austere overall lifestyle. And he said, like, I got there. Like, I was in a very high, unified state of mind, and it's very real. But I felt myself having like unfinished business and like missing the mess. Like, he wanted to go back to the mess of relationships and back to the mess of things being complicated and, you know, essentially going traveling the more individuation Jungian Platonic Western path. And then he stumbled across Neoplatonism and was like, oh, this is sort of the best of both worlds. It's a context that I understand better, that kind of fits in with the modern Western psyche better. And it's also very underexplored comparatively. Like, there's not people actively living this way. It's become this scholarly thing that's very vibrant and vivid and filled with spirit, and people are not exploring it that way. So he wanted to bring that back in
Mm.
to the academy to some degree. um so I feel that, and I think that's why Platonism is alluring to me too.
Hmm. Yeah, it makes me. It's something I heard recently is like a bodhisattva is a being who kind of looked over the wall of
Hmm.
enlightenment and then turned back,
Yeah.
rather than kind of fully jumping over the wall and living in that realm. That has a place in Buddhism for sure, in as like arhats and awakened beings. But the Bodhisattva path is about being in the world. And maybe
Yes.
you can have a glimpse over the wall, but then you consciously choose to go back to the mess,
Hmm.
because this is where the work is.
Right.
Um, and
Right.
again, I want to say it just one more time, like, not trying to take down Buddhism or anyone's path at all.
Hmm.
Again, I'm just speaking from personal experience here.
Yeah. And again,
My
I think
perspective. That's it.
totally, totally. Me too. Me too. And just to put the final piece of nuance on this bit, um, I think that there's a real wisdom that runs underneath all of this stuff that is nameless, that is revealing itself in degrees that we're capable of realizing over the course of many, many, many different lifetimes. And a great example of this is that um, the same Neoplatonist Iamblichus talks about three grades of souls, and there's like he calls it essentially like the herd of souls that is not conscious. They're never going to become conscious in this lifetime. They're just going to be basically subject to what in the East they would call karma, in the West they would call fate, and just the sort of um, providence and all of that stuff. Then there's like mid-grade souls who sort of realize that they're here to work on something. Like, oh, I'm in this incarnation because there's something left to be done. And then the third and rarest kind of soul is indistinguishable from a bodhisattva. They basically choose to incarnate and choose to guide and come here to like help other people on their journeys. And that's just such a great idea of one of those perennial truths running across cultures, like whether or not I mean, I'm open to the idea that it stemmed from some kind of real metaphysical insight that was had on the part of Iamblichus or whoever. But even if it's not, and it's just a sort of beautiful overlapping idea, that in itself is fucking awesome.
Yeah. It makes me think of, like, where are the bodhisattvas of today?
Mm-hmm.
Who, like, where are the spiritual leaders whose names we will remember 100 years from now today? I feel like we had a good batch of people like
Yeah.
this, in kind of the mid early 20th century, Gandhi, whatever, MLK, Mother Teresa, these figures who have kind of almost like been like enshrined into these roles and as these leaders. And I'm just curious, like, where are they now? Who are they now?
You might have just been on a retreat with one.
Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe, and not to get
Well,
too
Michael
excited.
Mead. Yeah, Michael Mead is who we're talking about.
Yeah, we're talking about Michael Mead, who I am just so honored to call an elder, and a mentor, and someone whose work has utterly, helped me step into my own and helped craft, my approach to pretty much everything I do. And then to be with him for 5 days with a group of 100 men from very diverse backgrounds was like a teaching all in itself. And yeah, I mean, truly, truly a master of what he does. And we're very lucky to still have Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think I can answer your question about where they are, but I think I think we could name off elements that they must have. Like people who single-mindedly and as purely as possible pursue something with an obsession and at their own and totally cognizant of like I will willingly burn the wick of my years on this planet into this virtuous direction of helping other people, elucidating ideas that people need, mythology, psychology, spirituality, in a way that is, I don't want to say it's completely devoid of personal gain, but personal gain is on the back burner. Let's put it that way. Like the pure intention is why they do it, and everything else is sort of a bonus, is sort of what
Hmm.
one of the telltale signs, it seems like to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I was also really struck by his generosity throughout the entirety of this retreat. This is a long retreat, and from the very get go, he's there, he's available, he's chatting with people, he's joining in on little impromptu drum circles. He's offering dream work at 7 a.m. He's taking these circles, these group processes sometimes till like 1, 2 in the morning.
Wow.
He's just like a overflowing cup, and to me, that is kind of one of the true signs of like someone that I am just deeply inspired by, that level of generosity.
For sure, man. For sure. Well, this has been an awesome mind meld, man. We could probably just talk all day, and I would totally be down to do it again if you want to get another one in when the book comes
Absolutely.
out. Um,
Absolutely.
Stoked for you. Congrats on the book. And from what I read of it, it's really really well done. I love how it's laid out. Your writing style is great. So
Thank
yeah,
you.
brother. Thanks for doing it.
Thanks so much, Michael.